Thank you, Bindia, for giving me the opportunity to speak with this group. Also, I want to thank each of the participants for joining and taking the time out of your busy days. I applaud your investment in learning about supply chain risk management and hope that you will benefit from this experience. My job, as John just explained, was to provide the motivation for supply chain risk management in the world that we observe today. And I'll share a framework for how one might think about supply chain risk management. Now, as you see from this slide here, this really is a synthesis of what we all know. If you're working in the supply chain domain, this is not news to you. But if you pull this together to come up with a couple of very important observations and findings. But in short, most companies today are buying materials from suppliers who are located all around the world. And similarly, they're selling to customers who are located all around the world. So each supply chain, even for the simplest product, entails conveyances that are traversing across many borders, involve many different parties. It continues to be a trend for outsourcing, although there's some movement recently for people using insourcing a little more actively. But the majority of supply chains today are very complex with many parties. And in the past 10 years, 15 years even, there's been a trend towards leaning out the supply chain, pulling out inventories. And what that leads to, in many cases, not all cases, in many cases, you have fragile supply chains. And so the result for supply chains, many of them today, is that they're very vulnerable. And they're certainly the vulnerability of supply chains are really a function of the entire supply network. So within your particular firm, your own internal organization might be possibly even very resilient. But if you haven't built that into your parties upstream and downstream, then your system is subject to being at a great risk. As we go over to the next slide, it presents some examples that many of us are familiar with. Gives you an idea of these, what we often think of as high consequence or high impact, low probability disruptions. And this is just a selection from the last couple of years. And I could say a few things about each of these, but I'll say a few things in general, is that many of these are regional events, but virtually all of them had global impacts on some supply chains. Now, we may not have heard about the global impacts from some of them, but certainly we know about the global impact from the earthquake and the tsunami and the nuclear meltdown in Japan, or from the Thai floods. Those particular disruptions were regional events, but had global impact on many, many supply chains. But the same is true for all of these different incidents. Some of them sadly have a greater incidence of loss of life, but many of these, virtually all of them, have some impact on businesses. And one other thing that one can draw from this, besides the regional event having global impact, is that there's a fair frequency of these, high consequence, low probability events. And it really begs the question of whether these genuinely are low probability. Listen, they're low probability in the sense that it's difficult for any one of us to say that with high certainty that there's going to be a disruption at a particular day affecting a specific company in a particular way. But, so that's very low probability of that. But it's fairly sure, we can be fairly sure that right now there's a disruption happening someplace. It might be a natural disaster, it could be a supplier failure, could be a labor action, could be a quality issue that's affecting somebody's supply chain. And that individual company supply chain is going to cascade up and down the supply chain, upstream to the suppliers and downstream to the customers. So that's happening right now, and because of the nature of the global supply chains, that's having global impact. Now, if we go to the next slide, we'll get a little bit of a taste of the impact. Here again is just a selection, not a comprehensive list, but a selection of the impacts and some quantification of the impacts from these different high consequence, low probability incidents. And we see here that, now this has boiled it down to particular companies, we see that the losses are not insignificant. But I will say that even the losses where we look at them where an organization or company, as I stated, that they've had several $1 billion of charges in one case, or another one is a $150 million loss, another one is a $400 million loss. The most significant one comes when your stock price is affected. And we see here in not just a couple of cases, but a number of them, where the stock price was affected by the announcement of a disruption. Now, our colleagues at Georgia Tech did a study and discovered that for disruptions that are announced in the public domain, there's a 10% loss, permanent loss of equity value. So when there's a disruption, there's meaningful and significant impact. And so this is not anything to shy away from or trifle with, because indeed this affects not only the supply chain and not just your customers, but the economic viability of the particular firm. If we go on to the next slide, we start to give you an idea of the broad list of possible ways and vulnerabilities that an organization is exposed to. Now, I don't expect you to be able to read that, and that's why John, if you could move that ahead, I popped up a few of them to make it a little bit easier for you to see. These vulnerabilities are segmented in 4 different areas: financial, strategic, hazard, and operations risk. But most global companies can look at these and say to themselves, you know what, we've been exposed to that this year, or perhaps it was last year. Maybe they weren't the most significant vulnerabilities, but they're vulnerabilities all the same. In any particular year, these are likely to affect a company. Now, in fact, with the permission of my colleague, Deborah Elkins, who used to work at General Motors, this is something that they use to communicate the breadth of all the different risks that their organization was exposed to. Looking at it, it becomes potentially a daunting challenge to think that one organization could identify and quantify all the vulnerabilities that they're exposed to, as we see here. I mean, literally, there's hundreds here. There's great power, however, in thinking about failure modes. Rather than looking at these potential sources of vulnerability, we can think about outcomes. And the beauty of thinking about outcomes is that genuinely, there's a very limited number of outcomes. And the next slide will show that to us, that virtually every disruption in the supply chain results in an outcome that is one or more of these 6 different outcome states. And it's basically the loss of a capacity to acquire materials, a capacity to move things, capacity to communicate, capacity to continue and run your own internal operations, the availability of human resources, and financial flows. Pick any disruption, they all boil down to this. So at the same time, it's important to understand the exposure that a firm has. It's also critical for an organization to make plans for these outcomes. Expect that these are going to happen and plan for them. And so a lot of the work that an organization must do is really in the preparation of business continuity plans. The next slide puts this into context. This is something that we developed a few years ago. It's a stylized life cycle, if you will, of a disruption, to give the idea of, well, what happens in a disruption and what are the different particular stages are there. We often are riveted by the disruptive event and then the initial impact. But there are critical things that occur, of course, in the path of a disruption. But perhaps the most important thing that we observe here is really in the preparation. That's step number 1. Virtually all of the organization's ability to perform after the incident is driven by an organization's preparation before the incident itself. So the shape of the curve after a disruption, we see a drop in performance of some kind that lasts for some period of time. That drop can be reduced, and the time before one returns to its previous state of performance can be shortened based on the organization's activities beforehand in terms of the preparation. Now, preparation is going to come in the realm of a number of different steps, and here I refer to ISO 31000 as a useful framework. The next slide shows this. Now, on the left-hand side, we see a very slick graphic that has arrows and shows some sort of a flow diagram. Listen, I boiled it down to something that's a little bit easier for me and maybe practitioners too to think about. that there are 5 different activities an organization really needs to embrace and tackle in order to manage the risk in their particular firm. We see them outlined here. I'm going to briefly go over each of these. I won't go into great detail. My colleague, Bindia, will go into greater detail on the second item, which is mitigation planning and implementation, which, from my perspective, is really where all the juice is in terms of designing your supply chain to become a resilient supply chain that has the capability of making your organization have economic viability and sustainability. But again, this is a very useful framework, I think, at a high level to think, hey, if my organization does these 5 tasks very well, then we're going to be pretty well set in terms of understanding our position and the risks that we're exposed to, and then managing them actively. So let's talk about the first one. The first one is called vulnerability assessment, and one of the first things an organization really needs to do, and not to say that this is easy, but one of the first things an organization needs to do is to map your supply chain. And that would be to identify all of your upstream suppliers and all your downstream, all the way right to your customers. Now, for those organizations that are serving individual consumers, gee, that's awfully difficult, and it's not realistic to say that you're going to have a map that maps out every, million one of your customers. That's just not realistic. But it is important to understand certainly the touch points to those points that reach out to your customers. Similarly, there's a challenge looking upstream. For many organizations, merely identifying their Tier 1 suppliers is a challenge, because for any company that might make a sophisticated product that has a big, long bill of materials, every one of those particular suppliers, there may be 2 of them. And every one of those suppliers might have 10 different suppliers, or 20, or 30, or 40 suppliers. So as you try to go upstream to understand your Tier 2 suppliers, who they are, where they are, and then your Tier 3, and so on and so forth, it becomes increasingly difficult. That's the challenge. Not easy. That's the critical thing. And that's important to understand, because it's the failure at a distant supply chain, at a distance upstream partner, where we see the exposure to organizations. Here, too, is the challenge for organizations to apply some quantitative work to understand and come up with some vulnerabilities that might help them identify where their exposures are, whether they're exposed, as you see in the slide here, to some of the various sources of risk. Let's look at an example that helps identify and expose some of the vulnerabilities that might exist in a particular supply chain. This is just a stylized example of a supply chain, one plant or one company, looking at the upstream supply chain, and merely starting with one supplier, one of their Tier 1 suppliers that might go to several other suppliers. And we see a little bit of a branch exploding up. This could be any particular company's supply chain. The company in question I was thinking about actually is an automotive manufacturer. And we move to the next illustration here. You'll see that there's an automotive OEM that is a car maker. Let's look at one of their sources of supply, which is the exhaust system that they procure from one organization. That exhaust, the company that provides that Tier 1 supplier who makes the exhaust system, might have 10 different components. I've outlined 3 of them here: the metal boxes, the electronics that go into the box, into this exhaust system, and the emission system itself. Let's go further upstream to the Tier 3 vendors, and let's look at the emission system. The emission system uses ceramics. Now let's go to their suppliers. It turns out, in one case, this was a number of years ago, but the ceramics manufacturer actually sources some of their raw materials from a company that makes kitty litter. Now, the way we discovered this example was that the automotive manufacturer found out that they had a problem with their exhaust systems, and it was causing back pressure in their system such that it was actually shutting automobiles down on the side of the road. And after an exhaustive look at all their upstream suppliers, they finally got to the ceramics manufacturer and said to them, "Have you changed any of the specifications in your products?" And they said, "Well, we haven't." They said, "Well, who are your suppliers?" So they identified the suppliers, contacted the kitty litter manufacturer, only to find out that the kitty litter folks had changed the specifications of the product. Now, the kitty litter people are only primarily thinking about little kitties. not thinking about the folks who make ceramics that ultimately goes into automobiles. And it was merely a small change at a Tier 4 supplier that ended up having a significant effect on an automobile OEM. Now, this doesn't happen every day, but the exposure is what I wanted to suggest here, is that it's awfully difficult for us to understand who our Tier 2 and 3 suppliers, much Tier 4, but it's really imperative that we try to find out who those people are and try to exercise some control, at least understand what the vulnerability is that we're exposed to. Because in this particular case, it was changing a specification. In another case, it could be that Tier 4 supplier goes out of business, or something else could happen in that upstream supply chain that will have a dramatic effect on your downstream supply chain. So that's a little bit about vulnerability assessment and the importance of mapping. The next step, of course, is in mitigation planning and implementation. And again, here my colleague Bindia will expand on. Let me just suggest that this is one of the more critical aspects of supply chain risk management. And it's really taking a look at your supply chain, planning for it to fail, expecting that it will fail, and designing it in such a way that it will fail in a way that the system does not completely shut down, that you can bounce back from it. And there's traditionally two methods of doing that. One is by reducing the probability of a disruption or the occurrence itself, and or reducing the consequences of that disruption. In the realm of reducing the consequences, that's where we call into play the aspects of resilience, using redundancy in some cases, and in some cases more likely using resilience or flexibility to get that resilience in the system. Again, I'm going to defer to my colleague Bindia to spend a little more time talking about that. So let's go on to our third aspect of supply chain risk management, and that's ongoing monitoring. It's critical and important for CIS organizations to design and implement monitoring systems where they monitor not just their own supply chain, but the supply chain of their monitor the health of their entire network. Now that includes understanding not only who your suppliers are and who your downstream customers are, but understanding what the health of those particular organizations are. This can be done by sourcing data from different kinds of news feeds, both on performance of businesses, maybe done in Bradstreet, and there's some other organizations that provide data on business performance, but also on regional activities and geopolitical activities. Put all that data together in the context of a geocoded map that shows, well, your suppliers and your distributors and your own plants, and you start getting a flavor and being able to at least real-time monitor what's going on in your particular supply chain. One of the measures, now there have been a few that have been used out there, but I think the most popular, and perhaps I'm not sure if it's the most popular, but I think it's to be one of the more effective ones, is the measure of time to recover. And that's used by Cisco. And this, as it notes on this slide here, this they use to identify the number of weeks required to restore 100% output following a disruption. And so it doesn't look at the post-disruption, being able to do better than that. It's basically how fast can we recover? And so the challenge for organizations in their monitoring is to say, all right, how do we monitor our ability to recover? And that entails going to your suppliers and understanding how fast they can recover from a loss at their particular facility. Now, there's some software emerging that can help organizations with this, and Resolink is one of the organizations that provides that. Again, I'll defer to Bindia, and she can expand more on some of the ways that organizations can use monitoring systems to help them make their systems more resilient. Let's jump over to the fourth and the fifth stage. Now, I packed these together because for many of us, unless you're actually in the crisis management or emergency response domain, it's a little bit difficult to distinguish between the two. It is fair to say that they are different, and there's a number of activities organizations need to take into play before any kind of a disruption. And as you see here, some organizations use response playbooks, meaning outlines of how an organization would respond to particular types of incidents. Now, organizations are probably not going to be able to figure out exactly what kind of an incident they're going to have, But merely going through the trouble of planning and exercising and training and the practice of responding gets them prepared for any kind of a response, or a disruption rather. Organizations ought to have put in place emergency response teams that have previously designated tasks and roles that they're supposed to perform, as well as protocols in place for communications, and be prepared for the lack of technology available to help them do their role, perform their role. One of the things that's important in this aspect is for organizations in advance to think about the psychology of risk. My colleague, John Brown at Coca-Cola, gave a talk up at MIT just in October, and he started talking about the psychology of risk. I was fascinated to learn that, as it says here, the human brain bypasses the cortex when dealing with risk and triggers not a logical response, but an emotional one. And so in the heat of responding to a disruption, we often feel like, well, you know what, gee whiz, we have to respond in a certain way. And the truth of the matter is that we're going to be driven to respond with our emotions rather than the logic. And it's better perhaps to think in advance what those pressures might be so that we can be prepared to at least recognize the emotion, the drive towards an emotional response, and be prepared also to think about what that logical response ought to be. My final slide presents some work that I did together with a colleague of mine over at Target, a guy named Bill Tenney. And we both observed that over the course of time, organizations followed, it looked like they followed a particular pathway towards resilience. And when I think about resilience, I think that encompasses also, well, I'm going to say it the way I'm describing it here, and it will include security, but a resilient supply chain does not necessarily mean it's secure. But we observed that organizations went from not really being sustainable, not secure, not resilient, highly vulnerable. They hadn't really engaged in programs like CTPAT or AEO, as you might find in Europe. And that was the starting point. For them, for many organizations, that was the point where they got on track to make themselves compliant with some regulations or voluntary programs. Then they became secure, and then ultimately they became resilient. So if your organization is not quite resilient, you might think about this pathway. I can't tell you what's the right steps to take without actually digging into particular cases, but this is the path that we've observed for many organizations. With this, I'm going to turn this over to Bindia and let her talk about risk mitigation and expand on some of the foundations that I've laid here. Bindia?
Great, thank you, Jim. Hopefully you can hear me just fine. Everybody, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Jim, and thank you all for making time today. My focus today will be to build upon the framework that Jim has articulated before us, and I will discuss how to apply some of these concepts in determining effective risk mitigation strategies. As we are showing here, this is our approach to supply chain resiliency: plan, monitor, mitigate, and you will see this is very much in line with the 5-step framework that Jim has just laid out. Because within plan, we are essentially recommending that companies address that foundational capability for effective supply chain management today, which is mapping, where we collect substantial amounts of information from suppliers about their manufacturing footprint, part origin, backup available capacity for recovery and response, as well as what Jim mentioned around the recovery time, which we'll go into in a minute. The next step is to quantify, right? So quantify those areas of the supply chain which have the highest impact or the highest risk score. This goes back to also the business case for proactive mitigation, which many people ask me about at these events, and we will go into building the business case for proactive mitigation in the next few slides as well. Using some of these concepts that I'm going to talk about, you can really sort of shine the spotlight, if you will, on your critical supply chain exposures and vulnerabilities so that you can direct mitigation activities in a prioritized fashion to those areas that need immediate attention. As we map the supply chain, obviously the next thing we want to do is to monitor global events And at Resolink, we do this for our customers on a 24/7 basis, which is really how we recommend all companies keep tabs on or put their pulse on events around the world. We notify customers about all kinds of events, whether they're the standard catastrophic events or labor strikes or transportation strikes, product recalls, factory fires, etc. And lastly, proactive mitigation is very key because and we will go into that quite a bit today, and we'll talk about how effective mitigation strategies can really be selected and applied using some of the insights and analytics from a robust mapping effort. Next slide, John. So here we'll talk about really where we can't always rely on a single approach, right, for managing risk. Typically, the three things we see, we know that we can't always do risk transfer by insuring risk. Premiums would be very, very expensive. We can't always be reactive either. We have seen from past experience over the last few years that companies have lost millions of dollars and left themselves too exposed to events around the world by being reactive. And obviously being proactive also, we cannot protect everything because our supply chains are, as Jim articulated, very, very complex, global, and multiple tiers deep. So therefore, what we're really saying here is we need to strike the right balance and optimize the three approaches to really manage our supply chain effectively. Next slide. So let's then talk about how can we direct our mitigation approach and mitigation resources and our limited budget to those critical areas of the supply chain and focus mitigation efforts there. Next, Joe. So what you're seeing here is a map of supplier hotspots, right? So this is a typical type of output you can expect from a comprehensive supply chain mapping effort. Here at a glance, you can see those parts of the world where a lot of supplier sites have aggregated. In our system, we color code based on the number of supplier sites in a given geography because it's easier to visualize quickly. And the chart below that enables you to see by country the number of Tier 1 supplier sites or sub-tier supplier sites which are aggregating in that country. This is a great view because you can quickly see, what are those top 5 countries where a lot of sites have aggregated. However, you can see the line, and the line really depicts the impact to business if you were to lose the sites in that country. And this can sometimes be very interesting when there are sometimes you have countries where you may not have a lot of supplier sites, but some very high impact parts might originate from those countries. So this is a great way to look at your overall global supply chain mapping effort and identify those countries where you have a huge exposure and where the macroeconomic situation may be relatively weak. Infrastructure might not be well developed because we all know, right, that a strong infrastructure and a strong economy can definitely help us to ensure faster recovery. And this picture gives you a quick visual to assess your dependencies very quickly. Next one. Now, we've looked at the 30,000-foot view. Let's drill down into the single supplier supply chain, right? Supply chain mapping can reveal a very interesting picture of the global footprint of that supplier. Some of your suppliers might have 30, 40, 50 manufacturing sites around the world. And in this view, you can see exactly what those sites are and where they're located on a map. And in the table below, you can see the number of parts which come from each location. You can also see the impact of losing each site based on location risk for each site. We'll go into risk scores in a minute as well. Now, if the supplier uses a subcontractor, then those suppliers will be identified, and you can see the subcontractor sites as well. And this also is very important for many reasons. In the last few weeks, I'm sure you guys have heard Walmart has been hit pretty hard by negative press because of a factory fire in Bangladesh, which killed about 114 workers. It turned out that Walmart had disqualified the supplier Tazreen Fashions, but a supplier that was used by Walmart had subcontracted business to the Tisreen Fashion factory in Bangladesh as a subcontractor site. And a proper supply chain mapping effort will bring out these types of dependencies. Next slide. So now we'll talk about multi-tier mapping. Jim definitely articulated multi-tier mapping as a very, very critical capability. So we'll talk about how can this help bring out those risk aggregation points in the supply chain. So next slide. When identifying sub-tier dependencies, we recommend asking suppliers for two things. One is, who are the suppliers that you are dependent on? And two, where are those supplier sites located? So there are two things you need to really understand about your multi-tier supply chain. The picture you're looking at right now, you're seeing a sample view for 4 tiers where we've been able to identify manufacturing sites that are used by the supplier down through the tiers. Here we started with a tier 1 supplier. We got their supplier names. We found the manufacturing sites for those suppliers. Then we went to mine some publicly available data about the suppliers, that is the tier 3, and we found out who those suppliers were. And we didn't identify all, but we found some critical ones. And then with some more data mining, we were able to identify up to tier 4 dependencies. The important point to note here is that we didn't just stop at identifying who they were, but at each tier we identified and located their manufacturing sites also. And this is very important, as Jim mentioned. This slide right now, what you're seeing here is showing you how that multi-tier mapping information can actually be used. The chart at the top shows how many tier 1 suppliers are all using the same sub-tier supplier. This is what we call a dependency map. In high tech, this type of a chart might have some of those wafer fab or assembly test subcontractors, for example, companies like TSMC or ASE or Amkor. And sometimes our customers find that 20 or 30 of their tier 1 semiconductor fabless companies might be using some of these factories. Going on towards tier 2 or 3, you might start to see some companies like DuPont, BASF, or Dow Corning show up on these types of multi-tier maps. The important thing, again, is to not only identify who is the supplier in that sub-tier supply chain, but also identify their site, because, again, from a resiliency standpoint, you really want to know where things are coming from, and you want to know where the multiple tiers are aggregating. One of the things I get asked a lot when presenting this, John, could you go back to the previous one? Thanks. One of the things I get asked a lot when presenting this is this information readily available? And the answer is, it depends. We do have to work quite hard to convince suppliers to share it, but we also mine it from some publicly available sources where we can. And then we work with suppliers to just validate it, and we find that is much easier. And then we also work with our customers. This is very important. We work with customers to give suppliers a transparency incentive, because the last thing we want is the supplier who provides this type of visibility should lose business because the business got yanked away. So those suppliers who share more information about sub-tier supply chain, we work with our customers to give out a trusted partner status, which results in more business wins rather than less. Okay, next we'll talk about recovery time. So Jim articulated very nicely the concept of recovery time, which is obviously something that Cisco has been using for many years. And what they call it TTR. We are calling it recovery time. And another time metric that we really recommend tracking in addition to recovery time is this alternate site bring up time, or you could call it the time to resume supply. And if you know what is sort of the average buffer inventory level in your company for a given part or supply chain throughout your supply chain, then these two numbers will give you a very good indicator of what you can expect, your expected allocation time to be in a disruption. And it's also a roundabout way to understand capacity utilization, which is very interesting. So recovery time is a great metric which helps to really identify what needs to be mitigated, but more importantly, how much mitigation coverage is needed. How much time are you really buying yourself with your mitigation? So we work with customers to really determine recovery time threshold, because this is a critical first step in crafting the strategy on what needs to be mitigated and to what extent. So let's look at how to do this. So here you're seeing two charts, and the first chart shows you the spread of the numbers of suppliers who have indicated that they have very long recovery times, and the second shows the actual number of parts which have very long recovery times. Now, for companies who have a very good idea of what their recovery time threshold is, this is a great way to arrive at a prioritized list of parts for mitigation. So for example, in the 930 parts list, which are parts that have more than 52 weeks of recovery time and are single sourced, you can sort descending by impact. And if you see there are parts here that are difficult to replace or complex, those are more critical. We'll talk about selecting the right mitigation strategy in a few minutes. And here I primarily want to show you how recovery time can be an effective way to prioritize your critical parts. Next one. Now, here's some additional insight that a supply chain mapping effort will reveal. Here what you can see is that supply has a lot of single source parts. But for 13 of the single source parts, the supplier actually builds those parts in 2 or more factories. And this is excellent, because now if the supplier is financially robust, then all we need to do is to validate that truly the supplier does build these parts in these two sites. And then we can leverage the supplier's mitigation efforts to protect our supply line with a capacity option instead of trying to second source the supplier out. Now, supply chain mapping and definitely, redundant manufacturing information has payoff, not only from a resiliency standpoint, but also as an effective cost reduction tool, which a lot of us have as our primary metric within supply chain, right? So this has great applicability in network design decisions on your high-spend parts, or even if you have products that are very expensive to transport, then this type of information can really help you with your transportation cost reduction. Next. So we've talked about recovery times. Now we're going to take a quick look at risk scores and what we recommend there. We find that risk scores, when you use those in tandem with revenue impact or impact of any kind, are a very effective way to simply bring the spotlight on those single points of failure in the supply chain. Typically, a well-rounded risk score comprises of some critical financial risk metrics at the supplier level, location risk inputs at the site level, as well as some recovery-related capability assessment of the supplier and the site, and operational performance metrics as well of the supplier, which all of us track on a regular basis. So the 4 things together we find makes a very well-rounded risk scorecard. The chart at the bottom is what we at Vulnerabilities call a vulnerability map, and it has the impact on the y-axis, risk scores on the x, and basically every dot there on the map is a supplier. So this, and you can actually have suppliers or sites or parts or products, any of those elements in this type of a vulnerability map, and basically it highlights those supplier sites, parts, or products which have the highest risk scores and the highest impact, and we recommend these are really your single points of failure, which you can then prioritize and mitigate first. Great. So here's what we call a quick cheat sheet on applying the risk scores to choose an effective mitigation strategy. Basically, we find that second sourcing, we all know in supply chain world, that may not always be possible or economically feasible. If you're not in a high volume business, second sourcing may not make good business sense or may not be cost effective for you. A good financial risk score capability serves as a very good leading indicator of bringing out those weak suppliers to the top. And this can then be used to determine whether you really do need to make the effort or investment to either find or in some cases develop another source. Now, if the supplier is financially robust and healthy, you might want to study their footprint, their manufacturing footprint, and identify those sites which are probably in risky regions or which are somewhat weak on recovery strategy. So when you look at recovery, we're talking about their recovery time or their business continuity capabilities. And rather than second sourcing, alternate site readiness might be a good strategy, or even protecting using the buffer and the inventory chart that I was showing you earlier. You might use inventory-based mitigations as a more cost-effective way to protect your supply continuity. Obviously, there are additional considerations around the cost of the mitigation or the time to switch sources, or even in some cases technology or quality would be other considerations that obviously your supply chain practitioners will weigh into making the ultimate decision. And your risk score threshold or your recovery time threshold might be additional. But we find that the risk scores do provide a very good foundational way to categorize your supplier sites and parts and help in choosing the right mitigation approaches. This is especially important to think about at your product design stage if you are implementing design for resiliency type initiatives for your critical products. All right, John, next one, please. Great. So we talked a little bit about the whole mapping and mitigations and how this can really help to become more proactive. Here what we're going to talk about is just the monitoring and how this can really help you to be the next thing of how can this help you to react and recover faster. Next one. We have been tracking global events for high-tech, auto, and medical devices companies that are our customers in the last couple of years. And the chart below shows for the short period of time between September through now, different types of events we have notified them on month over month, as well as the type of events. And it is surprising to us as well as to many people when we show them this, when they see how many factory fires happen worldwide on a regular basis. And this is particularly disturbing because factory fires can happen in any factory, or chemical spills can happen in any factory or location, and it's irrespective of your location risk. And in a high-tech setting, obviously, that sometimes when you have a clean room dependency at your factory, that even a brief 5-minute fire can have pretty radical and serious consequences. And obviously, some of us who know about capital equipment sourcing, we know that lead times for capital equipment can sometimes be as long as 20 weeks, 40 weeks, etc. And in some capital equipment, you'll be surprised there'll be your single point of failure because that capital equipment supplier is not in business anymore, and that capital equipment cannot be replaced. So we find that there are a lot of these types of hidden risks throughout that we're finding through an event monitoring capability. The beauty of an event monitoring system and having this type of a system in place is that you get notified about events around the world on a 24/7 basis whenever something has the potential to disrupt your supply chain operations. Next slide, Jen. So how can this really help you react and recover faster? So this is a quick example of some recent events in Israel. As we all know, some of our suppliers have sites in Israel, and we sent out the notification to our customers informing them about the conflict. But not only did we send them a notification that's very generic, but also laid out in the email itself which suppliers are there, which parts come from there, how many sites are there, and how many potentially products that might be impacted if this went on to become a worst-case scenario and shut down a factory in the region. This type of a discovery effort after a disruption can take days and weeks of people's time. And by then, what we're doing is everyone's trying to chase down the same set of suppliers, the same set of inventory, and the same sites. So in the next slide then, here we will articulate how a disruption might play out in the absence of a proactive mapping and event monitoring capability, and we'll try to distinguish the scale and impact if such a capability were, such a proactive capability were in place. So what you're seeing in the before slide are the, the 4 types of costs or impacts that would be experienced during a disruption, where number 1 is the resource utilization. This goes up as people start to go through discovery and finding out who's impacted, what parts, etc. Number 2 is the premiums that we end up having to pay on freight or inventory. And 3 is the cash burn that we would experience if we were to go lines down. And 4, obviously, is the worst case scenario if we were to lose revenue or lose market share, and obviously that is the biggest type of impact. Now, in the before situation, what we're showing you is that we pick up the disruption after a time lapse. Maybe a supplier notified us, or we finally got a PO that was canceled or something. And by the time we realize that this has happened and other suppliers might be impacted, and we go through the discovery period, everyone is chasing down the same inventory or the same capacity. Now, let's see how this would play out and in the after situation, where we have invested in proactive mapping. We have invested in a monitoring capability. In this situation, something happens. We've already gone through and started the mapping effort. We're in touch with our suppliers and collecting quite a lot of information about our supply chain and part origin. So, and also invested in ongoing monitoring. So when we receive the notification, we're already ahead of the game. We have already identified which parts come from the affected region, as I just showed you in the email. And so we find that we really are first at the scene. And when we are securing our supply lines, we're going straight from event notification to recovery with a very, very small discovery phase. And because of that, we might have to still pay maybe a 2x premium, but not a 20x premium to secure that inventory. And because of that, we have the ability to react better and faster and experience fewer lines down situations. Therefore, we experience less cash burn. And if we might go lines down, we wouldn't be as long. Our downtime wouldn't be as long as it would be in a pure reactive mode. And lastly, we might still experience some revenue impact, but hopefully, we will avoid making headlines and get a lot of the negative press and lose shareholder confidence, and avoid the major and long-lasting impact to business. So with that, very quickly, before we end, John, if you could go to the next. I would like to talk about Resilink, our company. We are a software solution provider and a very unique company. We're founded by supply chain practitioner and technology experts. We're the leading provider of a best-in-class solution and approach. Our approach that I've just articulated has been vetted by some of the top names in the industry. And our clients are some of the top companies in high-tech, automotive, medical devices verticals. Our supplier network is wide and deep, and for companies in these verticals, chances are that many of your suppliers are already on the Resilink platform. We have a very innovative approach to mapping supply chain, and our patent-pending plug-and-play solution is very, very cost-effective for all of the critical capabilities that we discussed today around multi-tier mapping, 24/7 monitoring, as well as proactive mitigation. We really hope you guys have enjoyed the information we shared today, and we look forward to seeing you back at future webcasts that we host. Thank you for your time. We'll welcome your questions and comments at this time. I will turn it over to John.